Santos is the 26th director of the U.S. Census Bureau. His career spans over 40 years in survey research, statistical design and analysis, and executive-level management. He previously served as vice president and chief methodologist at the Urban Institute, where he directed its statistical methods group. Santos has held leadership positions at top survey research organizations, including the University of Chicago's National Opinion Center, the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research, and Temple University's Institute for Program Evaluation. His research interests include quantitative and qualitative research design, like program evaluation, needs assessment, survey methodology, and survey operations. He also has expertise in demographic and administrative data, decennial censuses, social policy research, and research equity issues. Santos received the American Statistical Association's Founders Award, American Association for Public Opinion Research Award for Exceptionally Distinguished Achievement, Mexico's Otli Award, recognizing contributions to the Mexican community, and the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund's Excellence in Community Service Award. He has a bachelor's in mathematics from Trinity University in San Antonio and a master's in statistics from the University of Michigan. He also holds an honorary doctorate of sciences from North Carolina State University. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Santos this afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Oh, it's so great to see all these Texas faces. Yeah, and it's actually an honor to be back in my home state for this wonderful conference. As many of you know, I was born and raised in San Antonio. I think of myself as just another vato loco de San Anto. And I maintain a home here in Austin. I also own this little spit of land in the Rocky Hill country just south of Junction, Texas, where I can gaze at the Milky Way for hours, take in the natural beauty of the land, and just enjoy some quiet time. I was actually there this weekend. This land, this state, our richly diverse people, they all energize me. Hey, over the years, I've mostly been involved in national studies, but I've also conducted research in the great state of Texas, too. I visited many state prisons and county jails for a reentry study. I went all over the state for a large longitudinal survey of high school students to look at the impact of the Texas Top 10 Rule. I even designed a sample survey of state roads and highways where data collection involved gathering litter to develop a state estimate. So, although I've lived most of my life in faraway places like Ann Arbor and Philadelphia and Chicago and DC, it's the state of Texas that's always been a beacon, urging me to never forget my roots and to someday return home to family, to familia and friends. It's that Tejano history, in fact, a unique mixture of native Texan and Mexican American, that makes me who I am as a person and as a leader. I use my unique perspective often in developing insights and illustrating the value of diverse perspectives. In fact, I gave an illustration of that in my very first blog as director of the Census Bureau, and it's on the website if you care to look at it. Well, so much for reminiscing. We have a conference that needs to get kicked off, so let me give you some remarks. I'd like to start by giving, of course, a special thanks to our state demographer, Dr. Lloyd for his leadership and unwavering support of the Census Bureau and the state data center program. I also want to give a big thank you, a big Texas thank you to Monica Cruz for her commitment and dedication to to the data community as a steering committee member of our state data center network. And a final thank you to Associate Director Helen Yu, who I recently met at a conference of the Federal State Cooperative for Population Estimates. Now, the Texas Demographic Center, it's been a supporter of our SDC programs for over 4 decennial censuses. You have been a consistently active stakeholder. You've promoted the decennial census, surveys, and our data releases. And you've played a critical role in the development of our annual population estimates. Yes, the TDC represents an outstanding resource to Texans, to Tejanos, who need data, who need an evidence base for decision making. The center supports nearly 40 state and county affiliate organizations that serve every corner of the state. You conduct workshops and trainings, and you provide technical assistance. And we really applaud your outreach efforts using a robust web and social media presence. Okay, so let's take a moment. Before going on, I'd like to stop for a moment for a solemn remembrance. I would like to pay homage to and acknowledge the recent passing of Dr. Stephen Murdoch. He was Texas' inaugural official state demographer. He was also a predecessor of mine, serving as the 22nd director of the Census Bureau. Dr. Murdoch's public service was exemplary. He put personal gain and personal needs aside by serving as director of the Bureau during a critical point in its decennial preparation process. I know that many of you are mourning his loss just as we are at the Census Bureau. He will be missed greatly. Okay, so now I'll return to my original statement that it's a great honor to be here and address you as your director of the Census Bureau. And yes, I did say the word your director. This position serves the public. It serves our nation. And that's how I'm approaching my role. That of a public servant who's honored to lead the largest federal statistical agency in our country. As we all know, the pandemic, it shut down the nation just before Census Day in 2020. The Census Bureau nimbly adapted to our massive decennial census operation. And when its grip on society was the strongest, we still had to deploy hundreds of thousands of enumerators across the country. We had a constitutional mandate to do that. All the while, new challenges unfolded, such as natural disasters like wildfires and hurricanes and other challenges. Yet, despite these unprecedented challenges, our career staff, we came together and completed the job that we set out to do. That of counting the resident population of the United States. Now, I'm incredibly proud of the work and their accomplishments. But we recognized something that's really important, so listen carefully. We did not complete this job alone. We needed the public's help. We needed the help of our complete count committees, the help of state and local governments, the help of national and local partners, like many of you, and stakeholders. Not to mention, of course, we needed cooperation from the public. But without your support, we could not have achieved the measure of success that we did attain. We recognize that and deeply appreciate it. So let me tell you a little bit about how the Census Bureau is reaching out to our partners and the public. It's important because it includes you. Now, the ability of the Bureau to adapt nimbly during the pandemic, it truly opened our eyes. It showed us something we thought was literally impossible. that of adapting to and overcoming threats and doing so quickly. That experience motivated and the development of a robust transformation and modernization initiative to recreate how we do our work at the Census Bureau. We're undertaking a paradigm shift, literally, in how the Bureau collects, processes, and disseminates our statistical data products. It involves the development of new systems to bring data from all different sources together, both administrative data, census data, survey data, and so forth. We'll use new systems to create more efficient and effective data products that better meet your needs. Now, I'm not going to go into the technical details. You can ask me about them later. But I spotted an area where I thought, Rob, I could really help the Census Bureau. I knew, based on my 40 years experience, that such a transformation like this requires broad level buy-in from our staff, all of the staff. So I saw the opportunity to bolster that transformation that we were going through with an accompanying culture change. But a specific type of change, one that inspires staff to innovate by realizing the value of diverse perspectives. You know, when I first got sworn in, a friend of mine pulled me aside and they said, look, you know, he was formerly from the Census Bureau. You're doing a lot of research with census data. And he said, look, I know the Census Bureau. Trying to lead the Census Bureau is like trying to steer an aircraft carrier with a canoe paddle. Okay? And you know what? He was absolutely right. And he was absolutely right if you lead alone. But if your leadership is one that empowers staff and inspires them to think differently about how they work, then suddenly one paddle can become 13,000 paddles. So I figured that maybe one paddle won't make it, but maybe 13,000 paddles can help direct the ship to a new horizon. In any case, actively seeking and valuing different perspectives from different players in the enterprise leads, I believe, to better insights, better creative solutions, and better methods and better products. Literally, better data. I know that because I've lived it and I have countless examples. This, by the way, is consistent with the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But you know, you really don't need those terms to understand the value that flows from different ideas and perspectives on a problem. They can only allow you to gain insight. And now, if you take this cultural change that I'm talking about to its natural conclusion, then we must also actively seek and value diverse perspectives of our external stakeholders as well. They have valuable, diverse perspectives to offer. And that includes folks like everybody here today, including you. So I've spent this last year laying the groundwork for a continuous, ongoing community engagement process. I and Census Bureau staff met with numerous scientific and government associations, doing keynotes like I'm doing right now. We've conducted listening sessions with stakeholders representing both communities and data users. I spoke at conferences. Internally, I've met with career staff at all levels and in offices around the country. I went out on multiple field visits to check out what it looks like on the ground level to do an American Community Survey interview or a current population survey interview. I've conducted numerous media interviews and used blogs, videos, and other communications to reach out to stakeholders and to the public. I met with tribal leaders from around the country. Throughout these engagements, we listened carefully, we strengthened existing ties, and we established new relationships. And I must say, the experience was profound. I engaged with rural America and witnessed the struggles and joys of the lives of farmers and small-town businesses. I visited inner-city neighborhoods, spoken to local community leaders, to pastors who recognize the value of local statistics for their communities and neighborhoods, even though they express concerns about data quality. I witnessed the dignity of America's indigenous people and their honorable and indeed sacred way of life through living with nature. And I met with scholars and researchers from across the nation to understand their concerns. And after all these amazing experiences, here's my bottom line. I learned that it takes a community of the whole to maintain a fully functioning and successful federal statistical agency. We need to seek and act on feedback from stakeholders and partners and the public. We should be continuously communicating a value proposition back to you that highlights the utility of our statistical data products for your communities. We need to expand and nurture a trusted messenger ecosystem of partners, stakeholders that operates continuously, not just near the time of a decennial census. Such an ecosystem is a key for us to collect data from historically recalcitrant segments of our population that's wonderfully diverse. And that's why we're here to meet with you today. Yes, it's clear that we need to exploit new technologies, new methods, and new data sources, but we need to do this in a way that engages with and benefits partners, data users, communities, tribes, governments, and the public. That's people like you. That necessarily includes underserved communities, communities of color, rural populations, people on tribal lands, all those who pose measurement and participation challenges to us and to our data products. Only then will we be able to stay true to our mission, to produce quality data on our nation's people and economy. So the bottom line here is that we want to help you serve your communities better by helping you leverage the value of our data. Okay, so now let's turn to this year's planning priorities. I thought you might like to hear what's going on at the back of the Census Bureau, what we've been working on for the last 6 months. And we had a few. The first one is that we're involved in modernization of surveys. Household and economic surveys are increasingly difficult to conduct, if you hadn't noticed. We see declining participation rates, increasing per unit costs. And so we have to explore and invest in more tailored approaches to engender participation, which, by the way, ties back to our trusted messenger ecosystem. We'll be modernizing data collection operations by exploring alternative data sources to supplement the data, using blended data approaches and the expansion of things like artificial intelligence to ease respondent burden. The second priority is something called administrative records enumeration. We do after every census, we do a 2020, we do a post-enumeration study, and it helps us plan for the next census by taking a look, bumping up the results from that against what we actually collected in the census, and it tells us who we missed, who we double counted, how good the data was that we did collect, and things of that sort. One of the ways we're doing this type of assessment is through an administrative records enumeration, where we did in real time back in 2020, solely an administrative records census, all the operations, to see what we would come up with. We're also now looking to leverage that, because we found that in that post-enumeration study, the quality of the administrative records we used was better than that reported in our non-response follow-up area, when we have to go knocking on doors, and sometimes we had to go to proxy people, we had to go to neighbors or landlords to say, who lives there? The administrative data was better than that. So research then that we conduct will guide us on where administrative records are most effective and how they can best be used, especially to help us get at the gaps, the historically undercounted populations. External engagement, then, is another priority area. The net must be cast broadly here to involve a two-way flow of information, of ideas, suggestions, concerns, feedback. So we're going to continue to strengthen our ties, as I've said, with our data users. Find out what they need. What are we not providing? What mechanisms, visualizations, other forms of data and deliveries. And we'll also review and facilitate things like the Federal Data Research Center, of which we have our representative from Texas A&M here, if you want to talk to her. There you are. We'll strengthen our ties with tribes on a nation-to-nation basis and conduct outreach to communities that have concentrations of historically undercounted populations. Besides external engagement, we'll have complementary efforts with the internal engagement, because we need to engage both externally with folks as well as our career staff. Our career staff have lived with a culture of this is the way we've always done things, and we're looking to expand that, to allow people to bring their whole selves to the table, their culture, their values, their life experiences. And if you add that to your technical expertise, you end up with a different perspective that only you can bring to the table. So we're in the process of helping folks, allowing folks to bring those together to generate new, innovative ideas, creative ideas. Now, so I've talked about those types of initiatives. Those are the priorities we're working on. So let me give you a couple of updates, one of which I would expect the demographers in the room might be really interested in hearing about. It's the Population Estimates Program. It remains for us at the Census Bureau a continuing priority. We're addressing resources and staffing to bolster the breadth and capacity of that program. They need more staff. They need more resources. But let me tell you the story behind this. Why are we even doing this? Well, historically, population estimates start with the most recent decennial census. You know, that's bam, you do a census, that's the population in year 0. Year 1, okay, let's add the births. Let's take away the deaths. Migration, immigration type of thing. But in 2021, we didn't have that information that we needed to make the 2021 estimates because of COVID and the delays that caused in processing the data. So instead, we developed a blended base that took the available 2020 census counts that we had, you know, the 50 states for apportionment and the redistricting information. And then we added to that something called a demographic analysis, which is based purely on administrative records, on births and deaths and such, as well as a vintage 2020 population estimates, which is, you know, based on actually 2010 and then maturing it up over 10 years. We put those three together to create that blended base. And guess what? When we did that, we found out that we mitigated a problem, a known deficiency in the 2020 census. The 2020 census, we know that it undercounts certain subgroups of the population, but it also, one of which is 0 to 5-year-olds, young children. And by using this approach, we actually mitigated that undercount. And we said, aha, maybe there's some possibility here. Why don't we take this to the next level? So we formed a base evaluation research team called BERT, B-E-R-T. And they have been undergoing research to consider what other sources of administrative data can we use to supplement and to address some of the known deficiencies in the 2010 census. Because, okay, I hate to break the news to you, but I think you know this. No census in the history of the United States has ever been perfect. Okay? No survey that a federal statistical agency has done has ever been perfect. They all have limitations and strengths. And in fact, the value of the data increase when we know those limitations and those strengths, because you know what to watch out for. The university researcher will really get that one. But we do actually have really high quality data. It's just that nothing's perfect. So Bert is going to continue researching this and finding ways to improve our annual population estimates. And the reason that's important is because when people talk about all the federal funding, they're not talking about decennial census being used for federal funding. Decennial censuses are used for apportionment and maybe some redistricting. It's the population estimates each year that are used for federal funds allocation, and then absolute treasures like the American Community Survey data that are used to create policy and regulations on SNAP eligibility or free school lunches or housing vouchers or things of that sort. So that work will continue, and we'll keep you posted. That work is progressing. We're looking to create even better population estimates as we go on throughout the year. Another product I wanted to tell you about that's being released in the 25th, so in 2 days, is the Demographic and Housing Characteristic File, the DHC. It's a classic census data product, decennial census data product. And we're also releasing the Demographic Profile. These census data products, they provide demographic and housing characteristics of local communities. They're, standard products from 2020, really good, useful data. But in September, we're going to release something called the Detailed DHC, which is going to have really highly disaggregated race and ethnicity counts, as well as over 1,200 distinct American Indian tribes and Alaska Native village counts. So we'll have something unprecedented that we've never had before. At the national level, counts down to like 5 people belong to this tribe. We will be reporting stuff like that. We'll have, for lower levels of geography, there'll still be some of the disclosure avoidance stuff. But this is going to be the most detailed race ethnicity data that's ever been released. And I also wanted to tell you a little bit about the 2030 census. So we started planning that actually in 2018. I hate to break the news. 2030 is like 12 years before, just starting thinking about it. And because of our commitment to external engagement, we decided, hey, you know what? We think we know everything back in our home office. Maybe that's not quite true. Yeah, we know a lot. But why don't we ask the public for their ideas on how to create a new, reimagined decennial census? So we launched an effort to get that feedback, and we received over 8,000 comments. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We're in the process of assessing those, synthesizing them, and that, in addition to things like the results of the post-enumeration studies and quality analysis and lots of different other inputs, are going to be used to create our operational plan for 2030, and that's coming in 2024. And then once we have that, that will kick off a research agenda that aims to fine-tune that particular process. So I guess that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about. I did, let's see, let me look. No, I think that's pretty much what I wanted to talk to you about today. I wanted to absolutely thank you for the opportunity to giving you some updates, letting you know a little bit of how I think about things and how we hope to recreate the Census Bureau in terms of how we do business, how we engage with you, how we need you in order for us to achieve our mission. So please, take that with you. Let's work together, and I look forward to any discussion today. Thank you.
We're going to open the floor. We have a few minutes for any questions from the audience. Any questions for Director Santos that you may have? Please raise your hand, and we'll come over and And we have a mic, so we're going to want you to speak in the mic.
This is called the Ask Me Anything portion of our program. Ask me anything.
Welcome back to Texas, Mr. Santos. I wanted to ask you, I'm a senior public health analyst and was provost of a small Catholic college in San Antonio during the pandemic. So I'd like to ask you, there will be other pandemics, unfortunately, and disasters. How are you prepared, to do the census? And what did you learn from this past pandemic as you look at 2030 in the event that we do have a natural disaster?
Certainly. Thank you for the question. We understand that these types of calamities and other types of things occur, and that there's no way, they're unforeseen and they're unpreventable. So that means that when we come up with an operational plan, it needs to be robust. What does robust means? It means robustness at least from the statistical sense, I'm a statistician, means that it's willing to withstand departures from your underlying assumptions. And so what we're undertaking is, what we learned from 2030 is that if you have, and this is a big if you have a solid operational plan that you've tested and you know is ready, then only if you have that type of solid plan can you have a robustness that allows you to adapt it and change it quickly, because you started with a really good foundation. So we are unabated. We're just marching towards creating the best operational plan that uses the best technology, the best methods, the best evidence base from all we learned from our quality assessments, et cetera. This is the first time, in 2020, it was the first time we ever digitized the field operation itself, which means we have a database, trillions and trillions of data items that recorded every visit to every household we had to make, whether it was mail, whether it was a person knocking on the door or leaving behind a thing, what time of day, what was the result, whether we had to use administrative records, whether we did a statistical imputation, which we do for a tiny number of households. And that information is being used to help us inform, in addition to all the public comments and such for that. So we know from our experience in 2030 that we can change, but the only reason it worked was because we had a really solid foundation to work upon. So we're taking that with us to the bank, so to speak.
Another question?
Ask me anything. I need tough questions, by the way, please.
So I know you discussed about incorporating AI into research, and it's been a huge topic of concern or interest in a lot of research. How is that going to work with the census or future analysis of data and all of that?
Well, there are a number of different ways. They're almost innumerable, and we don't have the research expert that could just say, oh, here's all the things we're doing. But I can speak to a couple that are in use right now. So right now, and actually I probably should have said this, right now we're in the middle of an economic census. It's not really a census, but it's 8 million businesses around the country that have employees that we've selected, and we've asked them to complete a survey form. It's mandatory, just like any type of decennial census, but this one occurs every 5 years. And it's you can only take it online, and it has AI algorithms associated with it in a way that reduces respondent burden. So what do I mean about that? It says there are questions that say things like, what types of products do you make, so that you can then you can end up what type of industry is it, or NAICS code or whatever. And so typically the people start typing in a text response, and we use AI algorithms to take that, and then rather than listing out, the drop-down lists, rather than having a 10,000 drop-down list item that you have to search through, which you might as well not search, right? It uses the text that you've typed to identify the small subset that are most appropriate. reduces the respondent burden. We no longer then have to just take that text response until we get back, it gets back to the office, and then we physically have to look at it and say, oh, it should be this code. So there are simple things that could be done like that. More generally, though, we are in the process of preparing to leverage sort of, how do they call it? Chat BP or whatever that is. I'm old school, guys, sorry. But the chat functions, where you can like type in a question, what's the population or what's the poverty rate for Austin or whatever. And in order for it to come back with meaningful responses that rely on census data, you need the census databases to have embedded in the metadata that allows for a quick capture of that information. We're in the process of doing all of that metadata entry so that you can just go to a chatbot and have at it. Beyond that, we're doing other AI. We've used things like satellite imaging and AI functions or machine learning functions to take rural areas, and then you see structures, and it will show the probability. It'll identify structures and say, oh, that's a cabin. Oh, that's a shack, a storage area, etc. So we use it in that fashion too. And there's actually many, many others that we're using.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
So my question is also about artificial intelligence, but are there any policies in place to protect users and/or citizens from potential hazards caused by these new AI systems? Because we are in a place where the experts who create these AI systems aren't even fully aware of what these systems are capable of. So in other words, the experts themselves aren't the experts. I was just wondering if you have any policies to potentially defend against that, and maybe a way to opt out of a chatbot being included with your census data entry.
We don't have policies per se, but we have something called due diligence. We have a staff of AI data scientists who explicitly look at ethical issues associated with the implementation of AI. And so I'm pretty comfortable at this point that we're examining those types of issues. It hasn't led to any specific policy or any opt-out. But thank you for asking. I'll ask. I don't know if I see that one of our wonderful census experts is here, Michael Hawes. Do you know of anything like that, Michael?
Directly, in terms of like policies that have been implemented, no, I don't. But I know it's something that several people are looking quite closely at. So.
Okay. Who are the other census staff that are here today? Can you raise your hands? I know Michael's there. Hey, how you doing?
So we have several census staff who are speaking at our conference that are here today.
Welcome to my domain.
I think we have
Other
time.
questions?
Another question?
Hi, my name is Lauren. I work with Texas 2036 here in Austin. I really liked what you talked about of having more detailed race and ethnicity issues. And it's reminiscent of a talk I also went to at the CDC, and they were talking there with the keynote about the implications of having more granular breakdowns within race categories and how that's going to change the research sphere and generalizability. And so I was just wanting you to comment more on if you think that this is the start of a different type of lens for research focusing on different ethnic breakdowns and races, and if we could get more granular, what does that mean?
Sure. And let me answer it by saying in the spirit of diverse opinions or diverse perspectives, I take a little bit of a different perspective on that. And that is that, and I've talked about this in other settings, that we, society, are in the midst of a renaissance, a technological renaissance, but also a cultural renaissance. And the nature of the cultural renaissance stems from us being able to connect virtually and have relationships that we normally wouldn't have, either with family, across the country or across the world, or with other folks who share common themes like, hey, we're all Tejanos type of thing, or whatever. And because of new technologies like the DNA testing and there are databases for ancestry and such, and because of the increasingly diversification of our beautiful nation, our beautiful people in our nation, we are developing over time, because of all this renaissance, a deeper appreciation of who we are and a thirst to know more about that and learn more about that, which means that when it comes time for a survey, we want to tell our story. We want to say who we are, and not just a check the box, but let me see all the different combinations of who make me up as a person type of thing. And so I think that is what's driving the need. That plus our nation's diversification is driving the need to understand better who we are so that we can better govern, do better, more serviceable governance to the population, but also identify inequities and find areas where we can help in a more tailored fashion. So, for example, take the African American, take the black population in the U.S. 60 years ago, all you really needed was, are you black or not black, essentially. Fast forward half a century or more, 60 years, and suddenly there's been an influx of people from African nations who are black. And because nowadays about 1 in 10 blacks are not African American, but from Africa and have African roots, like in their first or second generation type of thing, there is a need, I would say there is a societal need to understand that complexity and disaggregation so that we can better serve the different segments of the black population. The same is true of Latinos. And the same is true because of the beautiful mixtures of Afro-Latinos and other, there are different races and ethnicities in all the mixes. So inherently, if we want to be a relevant federal statistical agency, we can't simply say it worked, 10 years ago or 20 years ago or whatever, to ask things like race, ethnicity, or even ask things like monthly income or work status. All of that stuff has changed with society, and we have an obligation to review that regularly and to adjust. Now, we don't happen to be, at the Census Bureau, the people that make the final decision on how to capture race and ethnicity. That, as you may not know, belongs to the Office of Management and Budget, which is part of the White House. They define regulations and directives on how to collect race and ethnicity and how to report it. Now, the OMB, it's run through the Chief Statistician of the United States, Karen Orbis, who is an absolutely wonderful Chief Statistician, and she almost immediately upon being hired into that position, established a work group and an initiative to re-look at the race ethnicity questions, because we have a Hispanic question and a race question, to re-look at that, and formed a diverse type of working group to come up with a recommendation for a revision that's coming in 2024. So that process is underway. It will, things that are being looked at are things like disaggregation of African American and Black, different types, Latinos, Asians, Native Americans, and others. And the MENA crowd, the Middle Eastern and Northern African peoples. So all of that is currently being looked at. There's actually a currently proposed version of that that's based on previous research that up to 2015, 2016 that had some really strong results on the value of using a single question rather than double. But no decision's been made. That's coming in 2024. Until then, we are required to use the 1997 version, and the only reason that that we're not simply replicating the 2010 and we have this unprecedented level of detail is because some absolutely brilliant folks at the Census Bureau, I'll just say it because I really believe it, came up with this notion that we can still ask, as required, the 1997 versions of Hispanic and race, but after each category have a blank line that says, and what else? And so a lot of people, because of societal change and appreciation of who they are and wanting to tell their story, they would say white and blah, 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 black, and then they'd write in about some other stuff, Latino, they'd write in some other stuff. And so we captured all of that and coded it, and that's the only reason that we have this new level of detail that we otherwise didn't. Does that help? No.
One more question.
I'm sorry, I have a question. I worked for 2 small towns during the census while it was taking place, and we know for a fact in both communities, they're rural, that large quadrants of the city were not counted. So I'm wondering what your team is going to do moving forward to make sure the smaller rural communities don't miss out on that. And my inquiry comes from funding, because when we apply for different state grants and federal grants, they look at our census numbers, and we've been told, at least on the state level, that on paper they're looking at the most recent census numbers, but kind of behind the curtain they're going to go back to 2010 because there's a lack of confidence in the census. So just wondering what there's going to be for rural communities.
Yeah, rural communities in general have historically been hard to count. We know that, especially if you get down, towards the southern border and their colonias, then there's like this intersectional effect of both sort of rural as well as Latino communities that are historically undercounted. But in general, all rural communities, we have a tough time counting them. And what we're looking to do is, through our engagement, it's not just for inner cities and it's not just for communities of color. We're looking to cast the net broadly to all communities, create this outreach set of network and partnerships to establish a trusted messenger network that's woven together so that when it comes time for the next decennial census, in addition to all the other methods and the research that we're doing for better ways of capturing the data and using administrative records or other methods, we'll also have this great network of local people on the ground who can discuss with their rural neighbors the fact that it's really important that they submit their forms. But I do want to dispel one myth, and that is that if a household didn't submit a form, they weren't counted, because that's actually not true. What happens is if you're a household with an address and you do not submit a form, then we send somebody to knock on the door. If still no one responds to the door, then if we have available high quality administrative records, we'll use that to enumerate the household. Otherwise, we'll continue knocking on the door and ultimately ask a neighbor or a landlord, if you rent, who lives there, and capture that information, or just get a count of how many people live there. Whatever, the bottom line being that if we know there's a house or an address that's occupied, we will find a way to create a count for that household. So the types of households that get missed are ones that are off the radar. And they tend to be things like homes within homes, in the back. Nobody knows about, that there's no address for mail or anything, and there's a garage apartment type of thing. So those are the types of situations that that tend to lead to undercounts. But in general, rural or otherwise, if we know a unit is occupied, we'll find a way to fill in for that. Yes.
One more. Yep. One more question.
Oh, and let me also say, since we have a second, if there are additional suggestions for how to address those types of situations and create that trusted network. We're willing and able and eager to work with you on that as well.
Director Santos, this is a little bit related to the gentleman's question. So it sounds like, they're trying to find alternative ways that they can improve on their 2020 number, right? And one of the methods that the Census Bureau has historically offered for municipalities and local governments is the count question resolution program, right? And the city of Austin participated in the program. We didn't get a very good result. But I'm hoping that perhaps, and we had a subsequent meeting with staff at the CQR division, it seems like a lot of that work is sort of now being pushed to the population estimates program. And so there is, a challenge mechanism in the estimates program as well. And I think something that could be very helpful for cities like Austin that don't feel they got a good count, or rural communities that feel that maybe they were undercounted, is if the estimates, and it sounds like you yourself felt maybe the base that the population estimates program developed may be an improvement for the 20 count for many areas, is there a way that the population estimates program may be able to provide some guidance to different levels of geographies, whether it's large cities, urban or rural cities, or places that might, consider different solutions? Because yes, we can improve to get to 2030, but what do we do now to make sure that our communities are getting the federal funding for all of those programs that are based on these population estimates?
Well, I have a couple of things to say about that. The first is that the federal funds allocation that goes on the basis of population, the proportion of the population that lives there, is relatively small to the overwhelming amount of federal funding that flows based on population data, but requires things like the data from the American Community Survey to establish something called the FMAP, which is an index from which then is triggered a number of benefits. So for example, the thing that one easy way to think about it is if suddenly all the people 65 and over in San Antonio came over to Austin, then they would be receiving automatically, Medicare. And that comes regardless of what the count of the population of Austin is or isn't. So there's tons of funding that come on the basis of eligibility criteria that are driven off data, but indirectly rely on the decennial census through a population estimates, because American Community Survey and pretty much all of our surveys rely on a calibration of the total population to the population estimate. So that's the one thing. The second thing is that we do have something called the Challenge Program that we encourage any city that believes that they have issues, they should provide their case, and we want to look at it. We need to look at it because we want to make sure that you have the best numbers that are possible. And we believe that, we don't put out a number unless we believe that it is good enough to, it's the, best quality available and it meets a certain, quality threshold. But like I said, nothing's perfect. We're always willing to take a look and improve. The final thing I'd say is that we have a lovely Texas Demographic Center and who are part of the Federal Cooperative for State FSCPE, Federal State FS Cooperative for Population Estimates. That's it. Federal State Cooperation for Population Estimates. I'm still learning, guys. I'm a work in progress. So that cooperative, as part of the population estimates program, every year that we put out, we rely on state demographers and other representatives of the FSCPE to provide input and such, which means they are usually and almost always very knowledgeable about the areas in the state that where population may have grown more than expected or dropped more than expected. And you can work with them Often, I know that Helen Yu has been working on some population projections. You might want to use those instead. That's strictly up to the state on how they want to use data and what data that they use.
Well, this will conclude Mr. Santos' presentation. Mr. Santos,
thank you.
Thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon and spending time.
As I said, it's been an honor. Thank you very much.
And we look forward to continuing this collaboration when we really appreciate the spirit of collaboration that you've begun with the U.S. Census Bureau. So, all right, everyone. So we're going to transition here over to our next presentation because I just want to stay on time, and especially also for our live stream. So at this moment, we're going to go ahead and transition to Dr. Lloyd Potter's presentation on State of the State. So we'll get his presentation up here in a minute, and we'll just go ahead and transition here in a second. Thank you. Let me go ahead and introduce you. All right, we're going to go ahead and transition over. So our next speaker is Texas State Demographer and Director of the Texas Demographic Center, Dr. Lloyd Potter. Dr. Potter was appointed State Demographer on June 4th, 2010. Dr. Potter holds a PhD in Demography and Sociology from the University of Texas at Austin, a Master of Public Health degree from Emory University, a Master of Science in Education from the University of Houston at Clear Lake, and a Bachelor of Science from Texas A&M University. He is a professor in the Department of Demography at the University of Texas at San Antonio, where he also serves as Director of the Institute for Demographic and Socioeconomic Research, also known as IDSER. He has extensive experience working as an applied demographer in several settings, and he will now be presenting on the State of the State, Demographic Trends and Characteristics of Texas.
Good afternoon. It's good to be with you. So I'm going to go through and just kind of give you a lot of stuff, go through a fair amount of data about, and I think I and my colleagues, particularly Monica and Helen, have been doing speaking circuits, so I kind of talk about this a lot, so I'll kind of hopefully be able to hit the highlights and see if you have any questions as we go along. But before I do that, I thought I might just ask everybody who's at TDC to stand up, all of our staff to kind of stand up and kind of be recognized. I am so fortunate to have just awesome, committed staff members, and I will say they make my life a whole lot easier. I probably make their life very difficult, but anyway, I'm quite thankful for that. And then I also thought, since UTSA houses a PhD program in demography, and there's a fair number of our students who are here, both alumni as well as current students. So why don't our former and current students just stand up for a second so we can kind of see where all of you are. Some of them are working for us. They're not going to stand up. Look, they're kind of... Come on. But I think one of our goals, though, is to generate people who have very sound understanding of demographic methods and demographic data. And you'll look to see, we've got the Austin City Demographer who came through our program and actually worked for us for a while. And so our goal is to really ensure that throughout Texas, and actually we have people working all over the United States and actually internationally as well, to really get people so they're familiar with the content and the data and are able to move the science forward. Okay, so let's start off here. We just heard about the 2020 census. Of course, it's been 3 years since the 2020 census, and but that said, you can see that Texas added more population than any other state. And we added almost 4 million, and of course, I'll be talking in a second about undercount, but I suppose if we didn't have any undercount, we probably would be over 4 million. And we grew more than any other state, and we're growing faster than all but a few states. I think actually 2 states were growing faster, Utah and Idaho, and they're relatively small. And so speaking of overcount and undercount, Texas was one of 6 states that had statistical undercounts. Our statistical undercount was about 1.92%. That, look at it, it's like, oh, that's pretty good. But when you look at it in terms of numbers, it's like 500,000 Texans. So it's not like it's an insignificant thing when you have approaching, at least as of the census, 29 million. You can also see there were some states that had overcount. When we look at that, and this is from the post-enumeration survey that Director Santos was just talking about a little bit, and the Census Bureau does a very good job of evaluating their work and really very honest assessment of how well they pretty much do everything. I mean, so that of course there's a census, but there are multiple, as you heard earlier, multiple aspects to the Census Bureau's activities. And they take it all, quality, very, very seriously, and work very hard to assess quality of everything that they're doing. So, but if you look here, you can see that Texas, this is for the United States. African Americans had an undercount of a little over 3%, and the Latino population almost 5%. So those are pretty significant undercounts. Especially when you look at Texas. Texas has more African Americans than any other state. And not many people are aware of that. If you actually count all of the African Americans in Texas, there's no other state that has more African Americans than Texas does. So a little over 3% undercount is a significant issue there. And then similarly, of course, we have a very significant Latino population and having a 5% undercount. So those two things probably are somewhat related to having the 1.92% undercount, the fact that we have very significant number of minority populations. There are a number of other issues, characteristics that are associated with undercount. Director Santos mentioned children certainly being a very significant issue. We have a lot of young people in Texas. We're a relatively young state. And so certainly that creates challenges for us there as well. But more recently, of course, the 2022 population estimates have come out, and you can see now that Texas's population is estimated to be over 30 million. And we're growing more again than any other state. So we grew more than any other state, adding between 2021 and 2022, 470,000. So we grew more, and we were growing faster than all states but 3 others. Now, I also wanted to highlight a couple of things, because here, when we look between 20 and 2021, that was the pandemic year, right? So when we look at that, we see that Texas, so last decade, on average, Texas added about 1,000 people every day. So between 2010 and 2020. And then when we look between 2020 and 2021, we added only 900 people per day. But then if you look with kind of coming out of the pandemic, all of a sudden now we're almost up at 1,300 people per day on average. So we're really trying to assess kind of the impact of the pandemic on population dynamics and population change, and then what's happening coming out of the pandemic, assuming that we are coming out of it, which I think we're pretty much doing. When we look at the distribution of the population in the state, you can see we have what we refer to as the population triangle, with Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, Austin, and Houston as the points. Very significant infill along I-35, especially from San Antonio all the way up to Oklahoma. But really the corridor, like from Georgetown or Williamson County just north of here all the way down to San Antonio, is just growing like crazy, and you'll see that shortly. But if we look at the population along I-35 and east of it, that's about 87% of our total population, meaning only 13% are west of I-35. And so that highlights a dichotomy in terms of population density and dynamics, where west of I-35 we're losing population in many of the counties. At the same time, these counties in the population triangle are what's really driving us to be the most significant growing state in the country. So it's kind of like, it's not like our population growth is spread across the whole state. It's really concentrated in some areas. And that has very significant implications for us in terms of planning, in particular related to infrastructure. When you have people, you need to have stuff to move them around, like roads, and you need to have water, you need to have power. And those are some of our biggest challenges, I would say, going forward, and will continue to be. And even though those probably are going to impact the urbanized areas quite dramatically, they all impact rural Texas as well. If you kind of go out to West Texas, the agriculture is very dependent on groundwater. Meaning that, and as the sources of groundwater dry up, essentially we have real risk in terms of growing cotton, cows, often referred to it as food and fiber. If you look at West Texas, it's very dependent on that, and with drying up of water and lack of the ability to move water out there, it's going to potentially really impact West Texas in a really negative way. When we look at population change over the most recent year, we have data for 21 to 22. You can see that, of course, we have significant growth that's occurring in the urban cores. Basically the population triangle. But if you look out west, you see, and actually in East Texas and South Texas, counties that have lost population. So 95 of our 254 counties lost population at this, again, the same time we're adding more people than any other state. So that's kind of, I think, one of our challenges is to kind of realize that we have very significant growing population and then places that are very sparsely populated. Here are the top numeric growth counties in the state between 21 and 22. Harris County was the second most significant growing county in the country that year. Interestingly, between 2020 and 2021, Harris County actually lost population. And as a demographer, I'm kind of like, that's just like crazy. So it's the second most significant growing county this year, but the previous year it lost population. So that's kind of an interesting thing, and we're still trying to kind of get our heads around kind of what's going on there. But if you look at the other counties, they tend to either be urban core counties or those suburban ring counties. Like Collin County is just north of Dallas. I think when I first started this job way back in 2010, Collin County was kind of like a bedroom community. Plano was like, out there outside of Dallas. Now Collin County is like, approaching and going to be eventually as big as Dallas County in terms of its size. And Denton County, which is right next to it, is also growing quickly. Fort Bend is just south of Houston. Bexar County, San Antonio, Montgomery's where the Woodlands is, kind of west of Houston. Williamson, just north of here. Tarrant County, Fort Worth, and Travis. And I could go on, but the rest of them are largely suburban ring counties. What's also interesting, if you look here, is in the components of change, is that fairly consistently last decade and going into this decade, both Dallas and Harris County, Houston, have net out domestic migration. So there are more people domestic migrants, moving out than are moving into those two counties. Now, of course, that's being offset by natural increase, more births than deaths, if you kind of look there, and then also international migration. So both Dallas and Harris County are increasingly becoming cosmopolitan, with people from all over the world living there. More and more people who are domestic living in the United States moving out of those counties. Now that's very different from pretty much all the other counties. I mean, if you kind of look at there's only a couple of them that have relatively small amount of domestic migration. A lot of them have a lot of significant domestic migration. When we look at percent change, which is an indicator of how fast the population is changing, I want to probably really highlight this last column here. I mean, when you look at that, most of the counties that are growing fast, and almost all of these are what we would refer to as suburban ring counties, those that are kind of outside of the urban cores, they're really growing from domestic migration. And of course, domestic migration is the thing that puts instant demand on infrastructure. So if you have somebody moving into a county, they're moving into a housing unit. If there is one, so there some real challenges there. When they move into that housing unit, they're of course turning on their water and they're turning on their electricity, running their air conditioner and kind of consuming that. So that's putting demand on it. Then they probably have a couple of cars. If they moved from somewhere else in Texas or moved from out of state, they probably have some cars they're going to put on the road. They're also going to be needing to buy stuff, so there's going to need to be retail. They're also probably going to have some kids, so they're going to need to have schools. And so when you see these counties that are all growing like by 90-something%, and they're fairly sizable counties, from growing 90-something% from domestic migration, very instantly, well, if you drive through them, which I fortunately get the opportunity to do, you'll see a lot of orange drums and detours, and because TxDOT's doing all they can to try to keep up with the demand for transportation. And then again, there's just like houses being built everywhere. It's just kind of and so one of the challenges, I think, for these counties that are growing very quickly from domestic migration is anticipating and planning for and implementing plans to expand their infrastructure. And infrastructure takes a long time. You probably know, it takes a long time to build a highway. I mean, to build a freeway, all the permits that they have to go through, and financing and kind of contracting, and of course, if you live in one of these places, you also know what it's like to suffer through the traffic that's associated with that, and so on. So anyway, I think this is kind of an important thing for us to be aware of, and certainly as you interface with local officials, also to try to, at least I find, and I think probably Helen and Monica are finding, as we go out and talk to people, the places that are going really fast are kind of freaking out. I mean, so that's my experience, that they're all kind of like, yeah, we need to tell everybody that we're growing this fast so that we can get bonds passed, we need to kind of get everybody on board with this. It's actually really important policy information, especially, like I said, when they're growing from domestic migration. Now, just recently, last week, the Census Bureau released estimates for places, meaning cities. And of course, Texas is kind of up there in terms of very significant growing cities. These are the most significant. Fort Worth, I don't know if it probably doesn't come as a surprise to many of us, but Fort Worth's growth hasn't historically been as significant as what we see in many of the other urban cores. That's changing very quickly, and actually the counties around it, Parker County and I think Johnson County just south of it, growing very, very quickly. But Fort Worth is definitely growing very quickly. San Antonio, and again you see Houston, which I was just talking about, between 2020 and 2021 was losing population. Now it's kind of way up there again. But then if you look at these they're either urban cores or suburban ring counties, many of them kind of along the I-35 corridor. Yeah, actually, kind of look here. New Braunfels and Kyle those are two cities right in between Austin and San Antonio, along the I-35 corridor, where Austin and San Antonio are kind of beginning to converge on each other. When we look at rapid growing cities, you can see Georgetown just north of here, Kyle, Leander also north of here. Little Elm is way up north of Dallas, I think. Conroe, Houston, New Braunfels. So these are all the cities that are growing the fastest. When we look at change over the last decade in Texas, it was driven by growth of the minority population. Only 4.7% of the total population change last decade was from growth of the non-Hispanic white population. So 95.3% was growth of the minority population. Texas is now, as of 2021, from the American Community Survey, estimated to be the Latino population is larger than the non-Hispanic white population. And you can see, the other population segments are, relatively stable. We see in terms of their proportion of the total, but the Latino population is growing very quickly, and actually the Asian population also growing very quickly. Those are probably the two segments that are growing fastest. And then, of course, the two or more race category also is growing fast, but that partially is a function of how the Census Bureau is coding race and ethnicity now. So I won't get off into a tangent on that. I just kind of put this up here to kind of highlight, is probably back to what I was talking about in terms of infrastructure, changing density of the population. Of course, with more people, there are more people per square mile. And if you look at where those are, you can see, of course, the most significant are Fort Worth and Collin County, and then Harris County, and then we go down to the lower Rio Grande Valley, you see some as well. Growth that's occurring as a function of births minus deaths. You can see Texas had, of our 254, 86 of our counties had natural decrease, more deaths than births. Many of our rural counties, what's happening in the part of the dynamic there is young people age up through high school, and if they want to go to post-secondary school, they're going to have to leave their rural community. And usually when that happens, they're probably not going to go back there. I mean, some of them do, but many of them will go to college or university, and they'll find employment. They'll find a partner there. They'll start having children, not in their community of origin, but they're having that now in the urbanized area. And who's left in the rural parts? But an aging population, meaning higher mortality. So you have more deaths than births occurring in much of rural Texas. And that's compounded by this net out domestic migration, more people moving out. So again, that's a real challenge here. I'll talk in a second about we're seeing potentially a slight change in that post-pandemic, or maybe with the pandemic. And then here's looking at domestic migration. Again, you kind of look at the I-35 corridor there, all of the counties surrounding Houston and Dallas, significant positive net in domestic migration. But if you look, 134 of our 254 counties had net out domestic migration. So again, this kind of strange dynamic that we experience. Of course, we're a big state, so I guess that makes sense. Now, in terms of components of population change, I'm going to kind of highlight a little bit about what happened last decade, what happened during the pandemic, and kind of coming out of the pandemic, what's happening. So here you can see that last decade, about half of our population change was from natural increase, more births than deaths. Frequently, I was talking earlier about 1,000 new Texans per day. I would occasionally hear politicians say there's 1,000 people moving to Texas every day. That was 500 people are moving to Texas every day, and about a third of all the new Texans are domestic migrants. About a fifth of them are international migrants. About half of them are babies net. So that's a factor that's what our dynamic looked like last decade, and it kind of looked somewhat like that the previous decade as well, somewhat similar. But then when you look at the pandemic, now all of a sudden domestic migration is driving our population change. International migration came to pretty much a standstill during the pandemic, and natural increase as a proportion declined. And then when we look at 21 to 22, you see that now international migrations pick back up. So with the receding of the pandemic and the relaxing of some of the immigration restrictions associated with that, we're seeing immigration starting to pick up more. And so now it's like a quarter from immigration, a quarter from natural increase, and really what's driving our growth is domestic migration recently. So here's just showing you this year by year numerically, and you can see the blue columns are domestic migration, the orange columns are international migration, and the gray columns are natural increase. And if we look between mid-decade and currently, you can see we've seen significant declines in natural increase. So, births minus deaths, and I'll talk about that here shortly. And then we've also seen significant declines until this last year of international migration. But then when we look at domestic migration, you just kind of see from 2016 and later, 2017 and later, you kind of see this fairly significant increase in domestic migration, and it really took off here in this most recent year. Now, the thing I was mentioning earlier, one of the things that we've noticed with the pandemic, and this one showing you 21 to 22 and comparing that to last decade, but if you look at all of these light blue counties, those are all counties that had net out domestic migration all last decade. So they were basically these counties that were losing population from people moving out. But between 21 and 22, they had net in migration. And if you look at them, they're all kind of rural counties. And so, we saw a similar pattern between 20 and 21 as well, that there were counties that were losing population all last decade from out migration, and that turned around. And so we think that probably has something to do with the remote work shift that we've seen in the labor force, that there are more people that are able to kind of work remotely, and they're choosing, we heard Director Santos has a place in Edwards County. I don't know if he has internet out there, but that's like, it's really in the middle of nowhere. I don't know if any of you have ever been there. It's kind of like there's not much out there, which is probably why he likes it, but probably not a whole lot of internet either until after this session. I'm sure there'll be internet all over the state. But nonetheless, I mean, we've seen this sort of shift occur, and you'll see a little bit later, I'll talk a little bit about commuting patterns and shifts that we've seen there as well. Now, one of the things that we've seen post-recession is declining fertility. That's been happening across the United States, so Texas isn't alone with that. But what is unique for the declining fertility is this, which is declining fertility among Latinos. Latinos have essentially been a very significant factor in terms of our population natural increase component, because they've had greater than replacement fertility. The non-Hispanic white population in Texas has had below replacement fertility for some time. African Americans kind of down to close to replacement fertility, and Asian population also has relatively low fertility. But you see with the recession, everybody's fertility declined, but Latinos quite dramatically. And then we see toward the end of last decade an additional decline in fertility. That has very real implications for our age structure. So if we look at these two population pyramids, the one on the left is 2010 and the one on the right 2020. And if you look here, you can see this little line. So these people that were 0 to 1 in 2010 are 10 years old now in 2020. but look at the population under them, that we're seeing this indentation in the population pyramid, which is being driven by what I was just showing you, the declining fertility largely among the Latino population. And so that is going to stay with us, this indentation that we're seeing here. These young children are going to age up into primary and secondary school, meaning they will have less demand for classrooms and teachers. They're going to age into post-secondary, and ultimately they'll age into our labor force, which is the thing that I think most of us Texans are concerned about if you look at this, because Texas is growing, and we have a growing demand for labor, yet we're looking at this indentation potentially aging up into the labor force ages, and that potentially will create some challenges for us to find the workers that we need. Okay, back to migration. Where are migrants coming from? Of course, usually if I were to ask that before I put the slide up, almost everybody would say what is the first line up there. Most everybody knows that most migrants coming to see Po-Chun over there who moved here from California. We essentially, Texas has been receiving migrants from California most of last decade, and that seems to be continuing. And then if you look at these other states, they all tend to be large states. Puerto Rico's kind of emptying out of young people. But if you look at these states and you look at the cost of living, and perhaps if you had some indicator of quality of life, it's probably not as good in those states as it is in Texas. I mean, certainly the cost of living is more expensive. If you were to sell your house if you're living in California and sold your house and came to Texas and took a job for less money, you could probably buy a bigger house and a new car and still be putting money away, and you're making less money than your salary was in California. I mean, so if you kind of do that basic economics, and that's happening over thousands and thousands of times where people have opportunities to come to Texas and work here, they're making that economic decision. And of course, then businesses also recognize that Texas has a significant and growing and increasingly skilled labor force. So just talking a little bit about migrants and looking at their characteristics. This is looking at educational attainment of Texans. So the American Community Survey asked a question, where did you live last year? And so if they lived out of state last year, they're the blue line. If they lived in a different country, they're the orange line. And if they lived in Texas, they're the black column. So you can see here that for less than high school, domestic migrants are much less likely to have less than high school compared to Texans, Texas residents, whereas immigrants, a little more likely than Texas immigrants. But if you then start going up from high school or higher, you see kind of these lower levels of educational attainment. Texans kind of dominate them. So some college with no degree, and then comparing that also to just high school. Again, if you look at domestic migrants and international migrants, less likely to do that. When you get to associate's degree and higher, you see domestic migrants have higher levels of educational attainment than Texans. Get to bachelor's degree, domestic and international migrants. And very frequently, I think we tend to think about immigrants as being low-skilled people. At least when I talk to various people, there's kind of this assumption that if you're an immigrant, you came over, you waded across the Rio Grande River, whereas many of the immigrants that are coming into Texas are coming in here legally, and they have high levels of educational attainment, and they're contributing very significantly to our economy. And that's also true for graduate and professional degrees as well. So essentially, Texas is importing skilled labor, and that's kind of the take-home of this particular slide. It's like and our economy is increasingly demanding skilled labor. I mean, our economy is growing, and we need people who have the knowledge and the skills to do the kinds of work that the companies that are coming here and the companies that are growing here are demanding. This is looking at the occupations of, so it's the same setup as what the previous slide, but this is looking at occupations. And the ones on the left are higher skilled, higher paid occupations. The ones on the right are lower skilled, lower paid occupations. And you can see the immigrants and domestic migrants tend to be slightly more likely to be in these higher skilled, higher paid occupations than Texas residents, and slightly less likely, with some exceptions for immigrants, less likely to be in lower skilled, lower paid. Now, this is looking at our labor force and change that's happened over the last decade. So between 2011 and 2021. If you were to add all of those blue columns up, that would add to 100, and all of the orange columns would add to 100. So when you're comparing the two, what you're looking at for any particular occupation, when you're comparing the two, you're looking at change that's occurred in the distribution of our labor force, the occupational distribution of our labor force. And so essentially, those occupations on the left tend to be higher skilled, higher paid. Those on the right tend to be lower skilled, lower paid. And so you're seeing that our labor force is increasingly working in higher skilled, higher paid occupations, higher proportion compared to 2011. And when the lower skilled, lower paid, a lower proportion than in 2011. So again, that kind of gets at the fact that we have this increasing demand for skilled labor. And going back to the previous slides I was just talking about, a lot of that demand is being filled by non-Texans. I mean, it's people that are moving here from probably many of them California, Illinois, New York, and so on, and internationally as well. So I always then raise the issue, it's like, well, why aren't young Texans filling these jobs? We need to be educating our young Texans to get to a place where they're the ones, when we go back, if I were showing you the previous slides, that we'd see Texas residents are the ones that are in those higher skilled, higher paid occupations or higher levels of educational attainment. Here's looking at educational attainment distributions by race and ethnicity in the state as of 2021 from the American Community Survey. So you can see here that, really the thing to really highlight here is that Latino population for associate's degree and higher, only 24.5% of Latinos have that level of educational attainment. Half of the non-Hispanic white population have that. 67% of the Asian and 38% of African American. In this next slide, I'm going to look at change in these distributions between 2011 and 2021. And this next slide is just kind of highlighting, I don't think I got, the slide I wanted to have in there didn't make it. I'm not sure what happened there. So I was trying to set up this particular slide. So the idea is we're comparing change between 2011 and 2021 by race and ethnicity and educational attainment. The thing to highlight here is we're seeing a decline. So if it's below zero, that means that we've seen a decline in the proportion of, in this case, of the Hispanic population, a decline in the proportion that have only a less than a high school degree among Hispanics. That's good news. There are fewer Hispanics that have less than a high school degree over the decade. But then you kind of look at all the other educational attainment categories higher than that, including only high school, are increasing. So we're seeing a shift from less than high school into some educational attainment among Hispanics. But if you look at the other groups, there are very significant increases in these really graduate and professional degrees among the Asian population, very significant. Same thing for non-Hispanic white and African American compared to Hispanic. So the point that I was trying to make with this is that we're seeing improvements among the Hispanic population in Texas, but they're not quite as significant and as rapid as we need, given you saw 50% of our population change last decade was from growth of the Hispanic population. So that's a and the Hispanic population is now over 40% of our population in Texas. And so this is definitely an issue for us to continue to keep our focus on, is how do we shift the young Hispanic population from low levels of educational attainment to bachelor's degrees, professional degrees, and so on, to where it begins to get toward parity with the non-Hispanic white population. Okay, so next thing, just a little thing looking at change in travel time to work between, and this is using the data from the 5-year sample, so between, we'll just say 2010 and 2020. But if you look here, you can see for sure that that travel time, the 60 minutes or more, in the longer travel times, we're seeing a higher proportion of commuters are reporting longer travel times. And that's to be expected. I'll get back to the whole infrastructure thing I was talking about. It's like, you got more people have to commute further in order to, and then there's more people on the road, and our highway infrastructure isn't necessarily built to I'll say our transportation infrastructure isn't necessarily built to really handle the growth that we're experiencing. And then this was looking at means of transportation, so you can see a decline in those people. So this is looking at 2011, 2019, which is the orange bar, and 2012, which is the gray bar, decline between 2019 and 2021 in those people that were driving alone to work. In some ways, I suppose that's a good thing, because then there's fewer people that are there on the highway with you in the traffic jam. And then go down here to work from home. See a pretty dramatic increase, and we think this is partially explains the shift that we saw in domestic migration that I was talking about earlier. So we think that's a factor with that. Okay, projected population. I'm showing you 3 different projections here. The top one there, the gray one, is our last population projection that was based on the 2010 census. And so we project out 40 years. So you can see that that we had the data that we used for this projection was early last decade, so between 2010 and 2015, fed into it. You can see we had pretty dramatic projected population growth, very significant. And then when we did our most recent projections in 2022, using 2010 as the base for the projections, you can see a decline in the slope. Now, when I've shown this to different audiences, some of them politicians, and they're concerned. It's like, oh, our growth isn't quite as fast as I'm concerned that our growth has slowed down. And my statement on this is, that's good news. We're still growing, and we're growing a lot. We're growing more than any other state. And that means that we have a little bit of time to address the issue of infrastructure. I mean, it gives us a little more leeway. I argue significant and healthy growth is good. Really, really rapid growth, not so good. Because it's kind of like we can't manage that very well. It involves, a lot of chaos associated with that, and it impacts quality of life if we don't plan for it effectively. So I'm pitching this as good news, that we're still growing, but we're not growing as fast. And then this second projection down here is a scenario where we take half of the migration that we used in the previous scenario, the blue one, and applied that. So it's a kind of a less aggressive scenario. Generally speaking, what we say is if you're doing short-term planning, you probably want to use our 1.0 scenario, the blue one. If you're doing longer-term planning, you might want to consider the orange one, or you might consider averaging the two. Something like that might be a consideration. And it probably depends on what you're planning for as well. So if you're planning for something that it probably would be beneficial to slightly overbuild, then maybe you want to go with the more aggressive one. if the implications are less significant if you don't overbuild, then maybe you go with the lower one. In terms of where the population growth is projected to be, we're anticipating pretty much the same as what I probably showed you on the first map. Significant growth occurring in the population triangle, especially the points of it along the I-35 corridor. Significant growth occurring in some areas out in West Texas. What's happening in much of that area is young people are moving in, and actually we're also seeing retirees, like people that are running farms and agriculture. They are tired of driving an hour and a half to the grocery store and to see the doctor, and their kids are probably living in Lubbock or Amarillo, and so they're moving into the urbanized areas out west as well. And this scenario too might change some with things that are, I know TxDOT certainly is looking right now at building a corridor up from Del Rio. I don't know what the highway number is supposed to be. I'm looking at my TxDOT colleagues over here to see if they remember what the interstate number is supposed to be. But they're planning to they're looking at building an interstate here, and that conceivably will draw a lot of the truck traffic off of I-35. Because a lot of the trucks are going up to I-35 and then they're going into Dallas and going east and west from there, or maybe further north. But I think the idea is, but if they do that, then that's going to cause, one of the things that we do know historically is that population growth tends to be strongly associated with transportation. So it's like transportation hubs, railroad hubs, ports, big airports. If you look at Houston and Dallas, both of them really took off after they built these mega airports. Of course, they're also, Dallas has had a significant rail industry for a long time, but Houston, of course, has the Port of Houston and also rail. And then, of course, just the interstate system as well. Okay, and then, so this is percent change, so the speed with which we're projecting change and the significant growth, certainly around the suburban rings, I-35 corridor kind of filling in even more and starting to fill in a little bit east of it. Again, and then the Permian Basin, which I'm sure I would be putting money on what this is going to look like, because it kind of depends on what happens with and it has historically been a boom and bust, both in terms of population and its economy. Last thing I'll mention data-wise is Director Santos, I think he mentioned the DHC is going to be released on Thursday. We don't have what we refer to as demographic detail yet. So the projections that I was showing you, we couldn't do that by race and ethnicity because we don't have those, or age or sex, because those data will be released on Thursday. And so once we get those data, then we'll start trying to generate some projections of the population by race and ethnicity and age groups and so on. But the last projection that we have, again, based on 2010, you see the Latino population driving the growth in Texas. Asian population growing very significantly, and also the African American population continuing to grow. Non-Hispanic white population pretty much leveling off. And we're anticipating, once we get the demographic detail file, that we might even be projecting a decline in the non-Hispanic white population. But we'll see once we get the data and we run the numbers. Okay, last thing I'm going to mention is our website. Some of you are probably familiar with it. But we have a lot of stuff there. We're actually in the process of revising it. I'm not exactly sure when we'll have that up and going. You see Alejandra, she's our communications person, just walked out right as I started talking about about revise. Well, we actually have a draft of it. There's a lot of data that feed into it, so we're working on getting all of those pieces together. But we think you'll find it a lot more, in fact, I know you'll find it a lot easier to navigate the new website once we're able to get it up and running. But we have a number of other features. We have like interactive maps, like here's one you can kind of pull the bar back and forth and zoom way in, actually down to the block level for the redistricting file. But a number of other maps on there. And then we have some themes, like different topics that we've generated maps for. And then we've also are trying to get up to speed with social media. So if you're not following us on any of these social media, we would be pleased if you did, because we're trying to get our followers up. But we are releasing a lot more brief reports and thematic sort of brief visuals and graphics and so on. So with that, let me stop and see if anybody has any questions. Thank you.
Questions, anyone?
We have 6 minutes.
Hi, Dr. Potter. My name is James Cardenas from the Texas A&M Transportation Institute. One thing that was on one of your slides for natural decrease. I noticed there was a pretty large natural decrease for all the major metropolitan areas. More deaths than births. I had a question on one of the slides.
No,
but
I don't think so. Let's come back up here. This one?
Oh, okay. Never mind. That's the question I had, and that clarifies it.
I would be if it is and I didn't notice that, I'd be concerned.
No, I was very confused. That's why I was like, wait, I noted it. That's
so
why.
the yellow areas have natural decrease, which are largely rural, and pretty much every place else has positive natural increase.
Okay, thanks for clarifying.
Sure.
Thank you, Dr. Potter. I'm Bruce Kellison from the Bureau of Business Research. What is your main COVID takeaway from a demographic point of view? Some of your slides show a demographic reversal after the population decrease in some of the major urban areas. But what is your core demographic takeaway now that we're probably out of the worst of the pandemic?
Well, I wish I had an answer for that, but I think the thing is we don't know kind of what's. I just showed you like 20 to 21 and then 21 to 22, so we're starting to see something different in 21, like as we're coming out of the pandemic, than what we saw before the pandemic, and I don't think. In fact, I can say I'm not completely clear what that is. I mean, so certainly the domestic migration component is a factor. I think with the pandemic, I've not really looked at more recent fertility data, but I think we saw a significant decline in births during the pandemic. Of course, we get a lot of calls from the media, and so as we shut down, some of the first calls we got from the media were, "Are we going to have a baby boom because everybody's at home making babies?" And I'm like, I don't think so, but we'll see. I can tell you I'm not. Of course, I'm outside of that age range, but you know, I think that's probably a factor. I mean, we saw, and usually when fertility rates decline, they don't come back up. I mean, if they do, it's kind of takes some sort of an anomaly, a social and economic sort of thing that's going to really cause it all of a sudden people to feel very optimistic, and when we look at a lot of Northern European countries, Asian countries that have had fertility declines, they do all kinds of things to try to encourage fertility increases, and they can't seem to make any headway with it. So I'm not too optimistic that we're going to see fertility kind of come back, even with more stable economic and times. I think that's likely to be something that's with us. And Texas has benefited from the fact that we're a very diverse state. When you kind of look at the Northeast and the Midwest that are largely non-Hispanic white, they've had below replacement fertility for some time. You look at their college, well, you look at their labor force. If you look at some of those sending states, you know, a lot of them are kind of essentially people, their economies are kind of, and so it is of concern. I mentioned this earlier, that if our fertility rates stay low and that's not being offset by net in-migration, that our labor force is going to potentially, you know, be sparse, and that has, you know, some very significant economic implications. So again, I'm kind of saying I'm speculating. I don't know what's going to happen, but I definitely have seen some changes here, and a big part of it's related to fertility. The other would be domestic migration, because all of a sudden we're just seeing this really boom in terms of domestic migration. We'll see if that continues, and that's going to be completely dependent on how our economy does. I mean, domestic migration and economic growth and decline are very, very strongly associated with each other. Good question, though.
Hey, Dr.
Emmanuel.
Potter. Okay. Yeah, you know me, but I'll introduce myself. I'm Emmanuel. I work under Monica and Dr. Potter at the Institute of Demographic and Socioeconomic Research. I didn't stand up earlier because I'm actually a master's student in urban planning. But anywho, I just wanted to know, because I guess we haven't really talked about it, like, well, how does like your role and this data like lend itself into ledge session, and what did ledge session look like this time around versus in the middle of the pandemic for you?
Well, I would say that this legislative session, we had relatively few requests for testimony, and that's not been true historically, that we've had, you know, a lot of committees would ask us to testify. I think Monica presented at one, and I've had a couple. We do get calls from legislators or their chiefs of staff asking us to come in and meet with them or to give them various things. It's pretty unclear to me kind of what we give them, you know, what happens to that in the meat grinder of legislation. I'm not sure how much it's actually being used. And there's a lot of variation from one committee charge to the next in terms of the relevance of demographic data. So, you know, I would say my experience this time is that there wasn't really too much demand for it. And of course, we're at the end of it, so I'm not expecting there to be a surge here at any time, because they're basically trying to just put periods at the end of the sentences of all of the legislation right now. I think, again, historically, we've had a lot more engagement, a lot more interest. We actually did a pretty effective job, I think, communicating to legislators about our availability and what we could do. I think another factor probably is the turnover that we've seen, in particular in the House, that there are a lot of legislators that kind of weren't really aware of us, and probably still, even though we gave them information, probably still not aware of us and who we are and what we do. I think post session, or we'll give it a little bit of time, but then we're going to spend a lot more time trying to engage with House and Senate staff members and trying to, you know, make them more aware of what we can do for them as a resource that can help provide support for any sort of legislation that they're trying to move through the House or the Senate. But yeah, it was, I think, overall kind of not somewhat lackluster for us in terms of demand this session. And we actually, I mean, Monica comes up here, walks around. I come up here, walk around, trying to find people. Just kind of like it didn't really kind of take this time. So we'll see.
Dr. Potter, we have a question from, we are live streaming this presentation. We have one from one of our guests. John is asking, is Texas foreseeing international migration continuing to be a major driver of growth in the 2020s?
Yes, it is. I mean, so in particular, I think post or kind of 21 to 22, we saw like this surge that was probably pent up demand that occurred during the pandemic. So we'll see post, like in 22 to 23, see if that continues, like if the demand was met this last year and now it's going to level off. But it's a very significant element, and then it varies from one area of the state to the next. As I mentioned earlier, Dallas County and Harris County, their growth is largely being driven by immigration. I mean, so they're having net out domestic migration, but I mean, Harris County is like growing. I think it was the third most significant growing county in the country, and a lot of that is from immigration. And so immigration isn't even across the state, but it is driving a lot of our growth, and it's driving a lot more of it locally when we kind of look at particular regions throughout the state.
I think we have time for one more question. Anyone?
Howdy. My name is Renee. I'm the planning director for the city of Gatesville, Texas. My question is about broadband. With the pandemic, one of the things that we've seen is there's been a prolific expansion of high-speed broadband, especially in rural areas. Do you believe that will increase the domestic migration to these areas that have been forecasted to have generally low population growth?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the implication that when I was talking about the commuting patterns and talking about the reverse migration that we saw in many of the areas. I think that, I'm not tying it to the availability of broadband, but, if it wasn't there, if people couldn't figure out a way to get it, and they're working remotely, then they're probably not going to be moving to places where they can't have good access to high-speed internet. And certainly, Texas is really fairly aggressively going to be rolling out efforts to expand rural access to broadband. One thing Director Santos didn't really mention was how the data from the 2020 census that were collected by the internet are like really good data. I mean, so they're better than the paper, better than somebody interviewing somebody. So I think we'll see the census, for example, really pushing internet, but it has to be available. So it's kind of, if you look at areas that had, I think, some challenges in terms of responses to the census, they're largely, we're talking a little bit earlier, I think there was a question about rural Texas and undercount. Part of that is because people don't have access to the internet, and it's like, well, you get a little thing with a URL code, or what do you call those little codes? QR code. And you can, with your phone, kind of like finish the census in a few minutes, versus having somebody come and knock on your door, leaving paper, and it's much less expensive. But I think that also has potential to really, when you have people that are doing what you were just describing, like moving to a more rural area because they can work, well, then those people are part of a community that was perhaps many of them are declining. I mean, so if you drive through many of those towns that used to be very vibrant town centers in Texas, they're boarded up storefronts. The county has taken over a lot of the retail space because somebody's defaulted on it. So you'll see people then are living in those places that want to improve quality of life, that are purchasing stuff that kind of will essentially fuel the economy in those areas. So I think there's potential for that expansion of broadband and people that have the ability to work remotely to go and live in those places to potentially result in, facilitating, some degree of return of the economic viability of many of these rural places in Texas. So that's, I think, kind of a hope, and I think for a lot of people living in those places, they're hoping that will happen as well. Because I think, again, I was showing you how dense everything is in the population triangle. If we can spread that out a little bit, it's going to make all of our quality of life, well, plus those people that are living in rural Texas are going to have a much better quality of life, but it's going to definitely kind of alleviate some of the pressure that we have if we're able to kind of get people to move out to places that have been historically rural and potentially declining. Okay, so I think that's all we got.
Well, this concludes our presentations for this afternoon, and on behalf of all of us at the Texas Demographic Center, we want to thank you for joining us here and for all of our guests online. This is the first time we've actually ventured into live stream world, so we know that some folks were able to join our presentations for live stream. And live stream's just today, so thank you all for joining us today. For those of you who are in person, we hope certainly to see you tomorrow. We have a great lineup of presenters. Also, just to let everyone know that, on our website, we do have the presentations posted. So if you look at our agenda, you'll see an icon that says View Presentation. So those are loaded. So if you want to have access to Dr. Potter's presentation this afternoon, it's accessible as well. So thank you, everyone. We hope you can transition into the foyer for a nice reception. And if you have more questions for Dr. Potter, I'm sure he'll be willing to join to ask questions out in the foyer. So thank you, everyone, for being here today.